The impossible assignment. The Central Galactic Council chamber gleamed with crystalline walls that reflected the bioluminescent patterns of 1,000 species. Ambassador Terrell 9 of the Morphean Collective stood at the podium, his 4 vocal sacs inflating with righteous anger as he addressed the assembly. "This is madness." His words rippled through 17 different translation frequencies. "The humans sent us a negotiator who cannot speak? This is an insult to every civilization present." I watched from my observation pod as the human in question sat motionless at the diplomatic table. Dr. Sarah Chun. According to the files I had access, she was 42 Earth years old, a specialist in what humans call body language and nonverbal communication. She wore a simple gray suit, her dark hair pulled back, her hands folded calmly on the table before her. "My name is Zildar, and I serve as a junior observer for the Council's Department of Diplomatic Relations. In my 17 cycles of service, I had witnessed countless negotiations, treaties, and spectacular failures. But I had never seen anything quite like this. The controversy had begun 3 rotations ago when humanity requested an emergency session regarding the Krovan border dispute. The Krovans, a warrior species with obsidian exoskeletons and a culture built on conquest, had been expanding aggressively into neutral space. 17 colony worlds had filed complaints. 3 smaller civilizations had already been absorbed into Krovan territory. The Council had tried everything. Economic sanctions failed because the Krovans were self-sufficient. Military threats were laughable because their fleet outnumbered the combined Council forces 3-1. Diplomatic overtures were met with contempt because the Krovans considered talking a waste of time that could be spent fighting. Then humanity volunteered to negotiate. The announcement had caused confusion. Humans were relatively new to galactic society, barely 2 centuries since first contact. They had avoided major conflicts, preferring to observe and learn. Most species viewed them as cautious, perhaps even timid. Their physical appearance certainly suggested vulnerability. Soft skin, no natural weapons, modest size compared to most warrior races. When they announced their negotiator would be someone who had lost the ability to speak due to a medical condition, the Council erupted in protest. The Krovans respect strength and direct confrontation. Councilor Reckel had argued, his reptilian features twisted in frustration. Sending a silent negotiator is essentially sending no one at all. But the human delegation had been insistent. Ambassador Chun was their choice. She came with an unusual request. The Krovans must meet with her alone, in a simple room, with no technology except basic life support. No translators, no weapons, no guards. Just her and the Krovan war chief Draknor. Predictably, the Krovans had accepted with savage enthusiasm. They viewed it as an opportunity to humiliate humanity before the entire Council. The meeting chamber. I secured special permission to observe the encounter from a concealed monitoring station. The room was bare except for 2 chairs facing each other. The walls were reinforced titanium carbide composite, strong enough to contain even a Krovan in full battle rage. War Chief Draknor entered first. He stood nearly 3 meters tall, his obsidian exoskeleton covered in scars that told stories of countless victories. His 4 arms ended in claws that could shred steel. His mandibles clicked with anticipation. To the Krovans, this was entertainment before the inevitable conquest. Dr. Chen entered alone. She walked with measured steps, her posture upright but not aggressive. She stopped 3 meters from Draknor and simply looked at him. Her face showed no fear, no aggression, just calm attention. Draknor laughed, a sound like grinding rocks. "The human semi-prey that cannot even speak? I will enjoy crushing your bones, little creature." Dr. Chin did not react to the translator's rendering of his words. Instead, she did something unexpected. She moved, her hand raised slowly to her chest, palm flat, then moved outward in a sweeping gesture that took in the entire room. She pointed to Draknor, then to herself, then brought both hands together, fingers interlaced. The war chief's mandibles stopped clicking. His posture shifted slightly. Dr. Chen had just communicated something profound, without a single word. We are here together. In this space. Just us. The language beyond words. What happened over the next hour would be studied in diplomatic academies for generations. Dr. Chin sat down, gesturing for Draknor to do the same. After a moment's hesitation, he did. No Krovan had ever willingly taken a seated position in negotiations before. It was considered a sign of weakness in their culture. But somehow, when Dr. Chin did it first, it became something else entirely. An invitation to set aside the performance of dominance and engage in genuine communication. She began with simple gestures. She would make a movement, wait for Draknor's response, then build on it, point to herself, then make a walking motion with her fingers, point to a wall display showing Krovan territory, then make an expanding gesture, point to the colony worlds, then bring her hands together in a protective circle. She was asking questions through movement alone. Why do you expand? What drives this need? Draknor responded. His movements were crude at first, warrior gestures not meant for nuance. But Dr. Chin watched with complete attention, nodding at each motion, showing she understood even when the meaning was ambiguous. Then something remarkable occurred. The war chief made a gesture that in Krovan culture represented hunger, but his following movements suggested something deeper. His massive hands curved to create an empty space. His arms spread wide, then closed on nothing. He was expressing emptiness, void, need. Dr. Chin leaned forward, her expression shifting to something I later learned humans called empathy. She mirrored his gesture, adding her own variation. She showed emptiness, then made a motion of many small pieces coming together to fill it. She was suggesting an alternative to conquest. Cooperation, trade, mutual benefit. Draknor stood abruptly. For a moment, I thought violence was imminent. Instead, he began pacing. His movements were agitated, conflicted. His people had known only war for millennia. The concept she presented was alien to everything his culture valued. Dr. Chin remained seated, patient, watching him work through the internal struggle. Then the war chief did something unprecedented. He made the Krovan gesture for confusion, followed by the gesture that roughly translated to "show me more." The breakthrough. Dr. Chin stood and approached a wall panel. She activated a simple holographic display, showing resource distribution across council space. No words, just visual data. She pointed to Krovan territory, showed limited resources, then gestured to blockaded trade routes. She made a cutting motion. Barrier. Wall. Then she showed an alternative. Routes opened. Resources flowing both directions. She used her hands to demonstrate exchange back and forth, creating a rhythm that even a warrior could understand. But she added something crucial. She showed Krovan ships not as conquerors, but as protectors of these trade routes. She made a fierce, protective gesture, acknowledging their strength, but redirecting its purpose. She was offering them something their culture could accept, a role that honored their warrior nature while serving a larger purpose. Draknor watched in silence. His four arms gradually relaxed from their combat-ready position. His mandibles made a soft clicking sound I later learned indicated deep thought in Krovan communication. Finally, he approached Dr. Chun. He made a complex gesture with all four hands, something that seemed to combine respect, curiosity, and perhaps the beginning of understanding. Dr. Chin responded with a gesture of her own, then did something that would become legendary in diplomatic circles. She extended her hand in the ancient human gesture of greeting and agreement. Draknor looked at the offered hand for a long moment. Then carefully, he wrapped one massive claw around it, not crushing as he could have done, but matching the gesture's intent. The first peaceful contact between Krovan and human. The aftermath. The monitoring station erupted in shocked silence as they separated. No treaty had been signed, no verbal agreements made. Yet something fundamental had shifted in that room. Over the next 3 days, Dr. Chin met with Draknor 17 more times. Each session built on the last, developing a shared vocabulary of gesture and movement that transcended the limitations of language. She brought in visual displays, physical models, anything that could communicate without words. She demonstrated human history through movement, showing their own transition from warfare to cooperation. She acted out stories of scarcity and abundance, of conflict and resolution. She made the abstract concrete through the universal language of physical expression. The war chief, in turn, began to share Crovan history. Through gesture and demonstration, he revealed the famine that had driven their expansion, the cultural shame of showing any weakness, the warrior code that demanded they take what they needed rather than ask. Dr. Chen showed understanding, without judgment. She acknowledged their pain, their fear, their pride. And then, through patient demonstration, she showed them alternatives that honored all of these things while creating a new path forward. On the 8th day, War Chief Drac Nor stood before the Galactic Council. He spoke through translators, but his words carried the weight of genuine change. The human who cannot speak has taught me more than 1,000 words ever could. She has shown me that strength can protect rather than conquer, that respect can be earned through understanding rather than fear. The Crovan Collective will cease expansion into disputed territories. We will negotiate trade agreements under the terms she has demonstrated. The council chamber remained silent for exactly 3 heartbeats. Then Ambassador Terrell 9, who had protested most loudly, began the rhythmic drumming that signified approval in 17 different species cultures. As I watched Dr. Chen sit calmly at her table, showing no triumph or pride, just quiet satisfaction, I understood something profound about humanity. They had observed us for 2 centuries, learning our languages, our customs, our conflicts, and they had identified something we had all missed in our rush to use words, technology, and force. Sometimes the most powerful communication happens in the spaces between words. The new assignment. 3 months after the Crovan Agreement, I received an unexpected summons to the human embassy. The message was marked urgent and included a personal request from Dr. Sarah Chun herself. The embassy occupied a modest building in the diplomatic quarter, deliberately understated compared to the grand structures of older civilizations. I was escorted to a simple meeting room where Dr. Chen waited, along with Ambassador James Park, the official head of the human delegation. "Thank you for coming, Observer Zildar." Ambassador Park said through the translator, "We have a situation that requires your unique perspective." Dr. Chen sat across from me, and for the first time, I noticed a device on her wrist. A translator keyed to gestural input. She made several quick movements, and text appeared on a holographic display. "Your reports on the Crovan negotiations were thorough and insightful. You saw things others missed." I rippled my sensory fronds in acknowledgement. I merely documented what occurred. "You understood the why behind the how." The text continued as Dr. Chen's hands moved. "That's why we need your help." Ambassador Park leaned forward. "The success with the Crovans has created an unexpected problem. 14 species have now requested Dr. Chen's assistance with their own negotiations. But she's only one person, and some of these situations are extremely time-sensitive. You want to train others in her methods," I said, understanding immediately. Dr. Chen's hands moved rapidly. "More than that, we want to establish a new diplomatic protocol, one that focuses on understanding communication beyond words. And we need someone who isn't human to help develop it, someone who can see what we might miss in our own cultural blind spots." The theory of silent diplomacy. Over the following weeks, I worked closely with Dr. Chen to document what she called the architecture of nonverbal understanding. It was far more complex than I had imagined. Every species communicates constantly through movement, posture, and expression. Her translator rendered as her hands explained. But we're trained to ignore these signals in favor of words. Words can deceive. Bodies rarely lie. She demonstrated by pulling up footage from a dozen failed negotiations. In each one, the diplomats' words spoke of cooperation and good faith, but their physical signals told different stories. Tension in the shoulders, hands positioned protectively, eyes that never made direct contact. The Morpheans, she gestured at footage of Ambassador Terrell 9, inflate their vocal sacs when they feel threatened, even when their words are calm. The Draxi's color changes betray emotional states their speech hides. The Vrelin's tentacles coil in specific patterns that indicate their true intentions. I studied the examples with growing fascination. "So you're reading what they don't say?" "I'm reading what they can't help but say," the text corrected. "Conscious communication, words, comes from the thinking part of the brain. But movement, posture, These come from deeper, more honest places. By focusing on this level, we bypass the filters and defenses that make traditional negotiations so difficult. She pulled up footage of her session with Draknor, watches mandibles. That clicking pattern appears whenever I introduce a concept that challenges his worldview. But see here, she zoomed in on a moment when the clicking stopped. That's when real understanding begins. His body is showing me when to push forward and when to pause. The challenge of translation. The deeper we went into the theory, the more I understood why Dr. Chen's condition had become an advantage rather than a limitation. Without the ability to speak, she had been forced to develop hyperacute awareness of other forms of communication. But how do we teach this? I asked during one session. Most beings spend their entire lives using verbal language. Asking them to set aside feels counterintuitive. Dr. Chen smiled, and her hands moved slowly, deliberately. We don't ask them to set aside. We ask them to add a new layer. Think of it as learning a second language that exists beneath the first. She demonstrated by bringing in volunteers from various species. Each was asked to tell a story while Dr. Chen observed. Then she would replay her observations through gesture and movement, showing them what their bodies had communicated that their words had not. A Phyrexian diplomat spoke of being comfortable with proposed treaty, but her three-finger hands kept clenching and unclenching. Dr. Chen mirrored the gesture, then made a motion suggesting internal conflict. The Phyrexian stared in shock, then admitted she had serious reservations she'd been afraid to voice. A Phyrexian trader insisted he was offering fair prices, but his four eyes kept darting toward the exit. Dr. Chen caught this, made a fleeing motion, then a gesture of hiding. The trader broke down and confessed he was under threat from a criminal syndicate and needed help, not trade. Story after story revealed the same pattern. What being said and what they felt were often radically different. Dr. Chen's method cut through to the truth. The crisis on Velker Prime. The real test came when the Velkorian civil war threatened to spill across 3 sectors. The Velkorians were a proud species with a rigid caste system. Generations of oppression had finally erupted into violence. The ruling caste refused to negotiate with the rebels, considering them beneath acknowledgement. Traditional diplomacy had failed spectacularly. Both sides spoke of peace while preparing for total war. The council was preparing military intervention, which would likely turn a civil conflict into a galactic catastrophe. They won't even sit in the same room, Ambassador Park explained during the emergency briefing. How could we possibly negotiate if they refuse to engage? Dr. Chen's hands moved quickly. They're already engaging, just not in the way anyone recognizes. She pulled up surveillance footage from the Velkorian capital. Military parades by the ruling caste. Protest marches by the rebels. To the casual observer, they seemed like opposing demonstrations. But Dr. Chen showed me something else. Watch the timing, her translator rendered. The ruling caste marches every morning at dawn. The rebels march every evening at sunset. They're deliberately avoiding direct confrontation while still making their presence known. That's just strategic, I pointed out. They don't want violence to escalate. Exactly, she signed emphatically. They don't want violence. Their words say they're enemies beyond reconciliation. Their actions show they're trying not to harm each other. That's the opening we need. The silent gathering. Dr. Chen proposed something unprecedented. A gathering where no one would be allowed to speak. Representatives from both sides would meet in a neutral space and communicate only through action and gesture. They'll never agree to it, I said. Both sides have too much pride. Pride is interesting, her hands explained. It's both the barrier and the solution. Velkorian culture values dignity above almost everything. Speaking to the enemy would mean acknowledging them as equals. But if neither side speaks, neither side loses face. The proposal was presented through carefully worded intermediaries. After 3 days of deliberation, both sides agreed to send representatives. The conditions were strict. A completely sealed chamber, no translators, no written materials, and no one could leave until they found some form of mutual understanding or 12 hours had passed. I observed from a monitoring station as 8 Velkorians entered the chamber, from a ruling caste, distinguished by their silver carapaces. For rebels, their carapaces unmarked by status symbols. They stood at opposite ends of the room, tension so thick it seemed visible. For the first hour, nothing happened. They simply stood, watching each other with suspicion and barely contained hostility. Then one of the rebels, a young female whose carapace bore scars from recent fighting, sat down on the floor. It was a gesture of exhaustion, perhaps, or surrender, but it changed the dynamic immediately. One of the ruling caste, an older male with decorative markings that indicated high status, hesitated, then also sat, not across from her, but at an angle, creating a triangle rather than an opposition. Others followed, not all at once, but gradually, until all 8 were seated in a rough circle. The dance of understanding. What happened over the next 8 hours was remarkable. Without words to argue with, without status to defend through rhetoric, they began to communicate through the most basic forms of expression. The young rebel pointed to her scars, then made a gesture of pain. Not accusatory, just honest. This hurt. The elder from the ruling caste pointed to his own body, unmarked but clearly aged. He made a gesture of burden, of weight carried. Different pain, but pain nonetheless. Another rebel stood and walked the center, making broad gestures that seemed to encompass their entire world. Then she brought her hands together, made a breaking motion, showed division. She was acting out their history, how they had all once been united. A member of the ruling caste responded by standing and adding to the story. He showed the establishment of the caste system, but not as the triumph it was usually portrayed as. His movement suggested fear, the need for order and chaos, decisions made under pressure that hardened into oppression over time. Back and forth they went, building a shared narrative through movement alone, each side adding pieces the other had never seen. The rebels showed their suffering, but also their pride in their work, their culture, their worth. The rulers showed their fear of change, but also their exhaustion from maintaining a system that served no one well anymore. Dr. Chen had been right. Without words, they couldn't argue about definitions or get lost in rhetorical battles. They could only show truth, and truth was harder to deny when expressed through the vulnerability of the body. As the 8th hour approached, something shifted. One of the younger members of the ruling caste stood and walked directly to the rebel leader. He made a gesture that in Valkorian culture meant respect between equals. Then he knelt, lowering his status voluntarily. The rebel leader stood, moved him, and helped him rise. Then she made the same gesture of respect back to him. One by one, the others joined them, forming a circle where they took turns making gestures of acknowledgement, respect, and shared purpose. When the 12-hour limit approached, they made a unanimous gesture requesting more time. The council granted it. 3 days later, they emerged with a framework for a peace agreement that addressed concerns from both sides. The protocol takes shape. News of the Valkorian success spread rapidly. Dr. Chen's methods were no longer seen as unusual, but as groundbreaking. The council established a department of nonverbal diplomacy, with Dr. Chen as its director and myself as her deputy. We began training diplomats from every species in what we called the silent protocol. The core principles were simple but profound. First, recognize that all communication is physical. Words are just one form, and often the least honest. Second, create spaces where nonverbal communication can flourish. Remove the tools of deception and force beings to engage with raw honesty. Third, understand that silence is not empty. It's full of meaning, waiting to be read by those who know how to look. Fourth, acknowledge that vulnerability is strength. When beings can't hide behind words, they reveal their true selves, and real understanding becomes possible. The training was challenging. Most species had to unlearn lifetimes of communication habits. We taught them to observe microexpressions, to read posture and movement, to understand the language of space and proximity. But most importantly, we taught them to be present and attentive in ways most beings never learned. The lesson of humanity. As the months passed and our methods proved successful in situation after situation, I found myself reflecting on what Dr. Chen and humanity had taught the galaxy. Humans had no natural weapons, no impressive physical abilities, no unique biological advantages. But they had something else, an almost supernatural ability to observe and adapt. They had spent their entire history trying to understand each other across culture divides, and that experience had prepared them for the challenge of galactic diplomacy in ways no one had expected. Dr. Chen's condition, which would have been seen as a disability in traditional diplomacy, had forced her to develop skills that made her the most effective negotiator in council history. She had turned limitation into strength through dedication and insight. One evening, as we reviewed footage of another successful negotiation, I asked her the question that had been building in my mind for months. Why did you really choose this path? Someone with your abilities could have done anything. Her hands moved slowly, thoughtfully. When I lost my voice, I thought I'd lost everything. I was a professor of linguistics, someone who lived in worlds of words. But in the silence, I discovered something more fundamental. I learned that we've been having the wrong conversation all along. We argue about what people say, but we ignore what they mean. I wanted to change that. And you have, I said. You've changed how the entire galaxy communicates. She smiled, but her hands corrected me gently. I've only reminded them of what they already knew, but had forgotten. Every infant, every species, learns to communicate without words first. We all understand this language. We just stop paying attention to it. Sometimes you need someone who can't speak to remind you that words are not the only truth. The future of understanding. The silent protocol is now standard training for all council diplomats. The Department of Nonverbal Diplomacy has prevented 17 conflicts, resolved 32 trade disputes, and facilitated understanding between species that have been enemies for centuries. But the most profound change isn't measured in treaties or agreements. It's in how beings now approach each other. There's a new awareness, a recognition that every interaction contains layers of meaning beyond words. Diplomats watch more carefully. They listen not just to voices, but to the symphony of signals that every being constantly broadcasts. Dr. Chen continues her work, training new generations of silent diplomats. She never regained her voice, but it no longer matters. She speaks more clearly through gesture and presence than most beings do with 1,000 words. I remain her deputy, a role I once saw as temporary but now understand as my life's purpose. Together, we've proven that humanity's greatest gift to the galaxy wasn't their technology or their courage, but their profound understanding of what it means to truly communicate. In the end, the human who couldn't speak taught the galaxy how to listen. And in learning to listen, we finally learned how to understand each other. The wars didn't end. Conflicts still arise. But now, when species face each other across the negotiating table, they carry with them an awareness that transcends the limits of language. They know that beneath the words, beneath the posturing and rhetoric, there exists a common ground of shared experience and honest expression. They know how to read the space between words. And sometimes, in the most crucial moments, they remember the most powerful lesson of all, that silence, when filled with attention and genuine presence, can speak louder than any words ever could.